I really need to get some art to put on these walls. Hi YouTube, my name is Jack. It is currently 8:45 p.m., so we're getting close to my bedtime. I probably won't upload this video until tomorrow, but I have things on my mind, so we're going to sit and talk a little bit about normativity and what normativity looks like in the context of a mystery religion like Wicca, and how to navigate normativity. This YouTube channel is basically just me making the same 3 videos over and over again. And part of that is just that I'm not a terribly original person, but part of it is also that there are a couple of key themes that I keep coming back to as I explore Wicca more and more, as I continue to practice and try to sort of swim down to the bottom of this well. And one of the things that I keep coming up against is how profound it is that Wicca is such an experiential religion. There really and truly is no one set of things that we can say all of Wicca, and here I mean Wicca in more of a narrow sense. I mean Wicca in the sense of Gardnerian and Alexandrian Wicca, but you know, there really is no single, unified, concrete thing that we can say this is exactly what Wicca has to look like. And every time I say this, I point out there are broad structural similarities. I could walk into a Gardnerian circle anywhere in the world and have a decent sense of most of what was going on. But, you know, the more that I interact with people who are farther and farther afield in the Gardnerian community, the more that I talk to people in Europe or in Australia and learn about all of the diversity of practice in the Gardnerian tradition and in the Alexandrian tradition, like there's just so much diversity, there's so much difference. And on top of that, even within the things that are familiar to me, even within the things that people do in a way that I recognize and that I would be able to replicate without having to think about it, right? Because again, there are these similarities. But even within those things, what those things mean to people, how people interpret those things, is wildly different from one place to the next. And people over here will be talking about, you know, it's XYZ is the real deep meaning of whatever. And, you know, people over here will be saying, no, it's not XYZ, it's ABC. And Wicca is, I think, a really fascinating case because you have some things that basically everyone is doing, but people are still doing those things in divergent ways, in ways where there's enough difference that from the inside it feels like people are doing very, very different things, even if everybody is, you know, broadly speaking, using the same magical tools or using the same basic setup for a ritual structure, things like that. But I think Wicca is a really fascinating case precisely because there's so much difference in what people do, and there's so much difference in how people interpret what they do, even when they're doing the same thing. People like to talk about orthopraxy and orthodoxy. I think that is a less helpful distinction than a lot of people think that it is, and I have a previous video talking about why. But just like, I think coming back to center on this notion that there is so much wild diversity within Wicca, and that that's a feature rather than a bug. That it is by design that every time you go to a different coven, you're experiencing something that feels in some ways familiar, but in other ways radically different from what you know. And that's a very different kind of religious experience than something like the Catholic Church, which has a unified body of doctrine and ritual, and you can kind of walk into a Catholic Mass anywhere in the world and know pretty much exactly what you're expecting. And I think that's fascinating. There might not be a point to the video. This video might just be like, woo, that's interesting. We'll see. I'm going to talk a little bit longer and see where this takes us. I think in particular, when we talk about the interpretation of the mysteries, that's a thing that's very easy to lose sight of, because there are ways that I interpret the mysteries that are deeply important and deeply meaningful to me. And not only that, but they strike me as essential to Wicca, and they strike me as obvious to Wicca. I, having experienced the mysteries and, seen them in a certain way, find it obvious that you should interpret them as X, Y, and Z. And it is every time I encounter someone who has done more or less the same things and takes away something totally different, it's a little jarring. And it's, I think, a really uncomfortable moment of cognitive dissonance for a lot of us. Because A, you are confronted with people who don't find anything meaningful in the things that you find meaningful, right? You find X, Y, and Z to be the heart of this religion that is a presumably very important thing to you if you have joined the priesthood and, dedicated countless full moons of your life to it. So A, there's a thing that's very important to you that other people are saying, doesn't do much for me, even though they're theoretically at least in the same religion. And B, you find other people who are talking about things that are very important to them that just sound nonsensical to you. And, people, you're over here feeling like XYZ is very important. And meanwhile, someone is talking about ABC, and you just think that ABC is the most inane nonsense you've heard in your life. But clearly to these other people who are part of the same religious community as you, this is something incredibly profound, and it's a really deep and powerful way that they have connected to the mysteries. And I think that variability in Wicca is, again, intentional. I think it's in there by design. But I think it's really hard to wrestle with. If we really sit down and force ourselves to confront that, I think it can be a really hard thing to accept. And to be clear, I think it is not the case that every possible interpretation of the mysteries is just as good as every other one. If you go through all 3 degrees of Gardnerian Wicca, and you come away with the interpretation that, the real meaning of the mysteries is that Jesus Christ is our only Lord and Savior, and we must accept Jesus into our hearts or we will burn in hell forever. You're wrong. That's not on the table. That is not a viable interpretation of the mysteries of Wicca. It's just not there, right? It's I think in some ways very similar to literature, to reading a piece of literature. If you read, I don't know, Oliver Twist, and you think that Oliver Twist is actually best understood as an allegory for the fall of the Second Islamic Caliphate, you're wrong. That is not in the text. Historically, that is not something that Charles Dickens was concerned with, and we have no evidence that he would have been concerned with it. That's not something that there is any evidence to support in the book itself. There's just nothing there, and you're pulling things out of thin air. I just this past weekend read Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov, and without giving away too much of that book or going on too much of a digression, the book is narrated by an academic who is providing commentary on a poem, and over the course of the book, it becomes increasingly clear that he has no idea what the poem is about, and he's taking this, autobiographical poem about the poet's experiences of loss and grief, and he's trying to force it to be this other thing about political intrigue in a foreign country. That's also true in the context of Wicca, and in the context really of any mystery religion. There are particular symbols, there are particular rites, and there are a whole variety of viable potential interpretations of those symbols and rites. At the same time, there are interpretations that are just wrong. And again, I think the obvious example is if you go through all of the mysteries of Wicca and your takeaway is that Jesus saves, you have fundamentally misunderstood Wicca. But within the framework of Wicca, there are so many possible ways to understand, experience, and interpret our mysteries. And different people are going to be attracted to different ones. I have talked before about how the experience of the goddess as divine femininity, the experience of the goddess as womanhood, is something that doesn't particularly resonate with me because I'm not a woman. But that's still on the table. That's still a viable and meaningful way of connecting to the goddess for a lot of people. Just because it's not a significant part of my own personal experience of the goddess doesn't mean that it's not part of the goddess at all, right? And it's on the table for anyone to pick up who wants to pick it up. You don't have to pick it up if you don't want to, because there are a lot of other things on the table that you can pick up. But it's still there. The fact that I choose not to pick that thing up off the table does not mean that it was never there in the first place. And I think that can get lost at times. I think it's a very human thing to feel like our experience is universal or should be universal. And so when you go through something so deeply experiential like Wicca, there are certain things that become very meaningful to you. There are certain things that start to seem meaningless to you. And it's hard to maintain the consciousness and the awareness that the things that are meaningless to you may still be a viable part of this experience of the mysteries, and that it's important to make room for those experiences with other people. And likewise, that the things that are meaningful to you are potentially meaningless to someone else. It's very hard to talk about this without going into examples. It's very hard to go into examples without sort of violating my own personal sense of what is and is not appropriate to talk about in public. But broadly speaking, some of the things, this is a non-exhaustive list, some of the things that people have thought Wicca is about include human reproductive fertility, the cycles of life and death more broadly, which leads into reincarnation more specifically, love, which can include any of a variety of things, including romantic love, familial love, sexual love, specifically spell casting. There are people who think of Wicca really and truly just as a spell casting cult. There are people who think of Wicca as being about polarity or about the four elements. There are people who think of Wicca as being about gender specifically. And then those people may or may not align with the people who think that Wicca is about biological reproductive fertility, depending on what their view of gender is. And these are all things that people have thought and continue to think about Wicca. There are more things that people have thought and continue to think. These things sometimes overlap, they sometimes diverge, but they're kind of all there. And I think it's sometimes difficult to remember that they're all there, because you look at some of them and you go, oh God, that's such bullshit. That's such bullshit. I can't believe anyone would take that seriously. But there are people who do take it seriously. And we don't get to legislate other people's experience. Which means that the things that I think of as bullshit, I'm allowed to privately think of them as bullshit. But they're still real and legitimate and acceptable ways of engaging with this thing that is Wicca. And that then comes into the whole like Coven autonomy thing that you hear that phrase thrown around a lot. Really what Coven autonomy comes down to is just the idea that you don't get to legislate what other people are doing. And you don't get to legislate other people's experiences, and you also don't get to legislate other people's choices based on those experiences. So, I don't really do much with the four elements anymore. I got really burnt out on the four elements, and now I kind of just, they're not interesting to me. I find them magically sterile. I'm left cold by them, and have been for a long time. But I don't get to go around telling other people that they can't do anything with the four elements in their covens, right? There's, I think, this deep impulse when we find something that is really meaningful to us, and we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to get to the heart of it, meditating and reading and doing ritual and deepening our relationship to this incredibly meaningful thing. And we find our way into something that feels right. And we feel like we understand it, or at least understand some of it, because, right, with a mystery religion, part of the idea is that you're never going to understand all of it. But we feel like we understand some of it, at least, and we feel like we understand that really well, and it makes sense to us, and it's important to us. It's really hard to be able to let that just be personal. And when we see someone else doing nominally the same thing, but doing it in a way that is totally contradictory to the understanding we've come to that is so important for us, it's really hard to be an adult about that and to let other people do things their way and find meaning for themselves that maybe wasn't there for us. And, there are people who are better at this. There are people who are worse at this. I have gotten a lot better about it over the course of my time in Wicca, right? I certainly started out in Wicca very judgmental and know-it-all, and, I can't believe that these people are doing that. Don't these people know anything? Weren't they properly trained? And eventually, you gotta just let that shit go. You gotta just trust that other people do know what they're doing, and it might just be the case that what they're doing is not exactly the same as what you're doing, and that's okay, because they're not trying to do exactly the same thing as what you're doing. There are so many potential mysteries to explore in Wicca, and some of those mysteries are very important to me, but if there's another coven that is exploring the mysteries in a different way and is emphasizing ones that I consider totally unimportant and de-emphasizing ones that I consider really the heart of what I'm doing, that's their business. That's their practice. So, I don't know that there's really a point to this video, except that I've just been thinking a lot around the shape of what happens when you put 5 experts in a room and find out that they're all nominally experts on the same thing, but actually doing wildly different things. And here, I'm not counting myself among the experts. I'm saying, when I, meet coven leaders from other covens and I see them interacting with each other, and you can sort of see the tensions emerge when someone says, well, this thing about, I don't know, the candles is really important to me, and someone else treats that like it's dirt. And I think it's a very understandable thing to want to do, to impose that normativity and try to want our experience to be a standard for everyone else, because our experience has been so important to us and we feel like we got it right. But I do think that the heart of Wicca involves allowing everyone to have their own experience, because the mysteries are inexpressible. And importantly, the mysteries are bigger than us. And there's always going to be more to them than what any of us understands. And it's okay for there to be room for other people to have those different interpretations. So, all right, this was kind of a pointless video. I'm going to wrap it up here. Have a good night, everyone. I will talk to you sometime soon. Bye.